Back in the days of stagecoaches and steam locomotives, long before the automobile was king, transporting valuables across long distances was an exceptionally risky endeavor. If you were lucky, you could afford to hire guards for this journey, but even then you were looking at days, weeks, or even months of difficult travel. Depending on the route, that could mean braving roads that were rarely traversed, usually passing through large expanses of unsettled plains, forests, and mountain ranges. This unsurprisingly left ample opportunity for the rogues and scoundrels of the American West, the ones that have become so famous thanks to Hollywood's many Western films, to take advantage of the situation. One moment you're riding along in peace, and then the next you're surrounded on all sides. This was an all too common occurrence throughout the 1800s, and making matters even worse was the fact that the men robbing you were highly likely to kill you after robbing you, even if you complied with their demands. It was just simply safer that way. No survivors meant no witnesses to notify the local authorities, and no chance of being recognized months or even years down the line. The chance of running into bandits was a known risk that anyone hauling goods in those days knew and accepted. However, there was one man, one robber, who did things a bit differently, and those that met him never forgot the unique way that they were treated. This man's name was Ezra Allen Miner, although even from an early age he detested his given name, opting instead to go by the much simpler Bill Miner. And what set him apart from his contemporaries was the unique politeness that he employed while robbing people. Instead of engaging in impromptu gunfights and discharging his weapon haphazardly to maintain order the way most highway robbers in his day did, Bill had an established rule that neither he nor his men were allowed to fire their guns unless physically threatened. That meant if there was no immediate danger, then guns could be pulled but not used. This peculiar rule, as well as the soft-spoken manner in which Bill spoke to his victims while robbing them, earned him many positive nicknames, such as the Gentleman Bandit, the Gentleman Robber, and the Gray Fox. It also earned him a reputation that, despite him robbing countless people and spending over half of his life in prison, is still relatively positive to this day. Many see him as a Robin Hood-type folk hero and affectionately look past his misdeeds in favor of his more admirable qualities. For my first ever video on this channel, we'll be taking a deep look into Bill's life and sorting through his complicated, yet fascinating legacy. Born sometime in the early to mid-1840s in Bowling Green, Kentucky, Bill Miner was raised on a farm by his mother, who was a schoolteacher, and his father, who, appropriately, was a mining engineer. At least, that's what most people believe. Unfortunately, like the details of many old stories that have been passed down by word of mouth for over a century, many of the specifics surrounding Bill's early years have been lost to time. There are conflicting reports concerning everything from Bill's real last name, which some claim was actually McDonald, all the way to his nationality, with some people believing that he was actually born in Canada and immigrated to the United States shortly after his birth. These uncertainties mean that despite what some sources list as fact, nobody really knows for sure. However, what is generally agreed upon is Bill had a humble upbringing where he learned right from wrong and was taught how to read and write in English as well as perform basic arithmetic. In those days, this comparatively meager education would have put him a step above the other children around him, which is why people tend to believe that his mother was in fact a schoolteacher. Thankfully, we don't need to dwell on these details for too long because the interesting aspect of Bill's life began sometime near 1860, around the time he turned 16 years old. This is when he left home, setting his sights on the American West, where he hoped to find more profitable work than was available to him in Kentucky. Just a short time after setting out, he had traveled all over Texas, New Mexico, and Mexico, as well as other areas that would someday be settled U.S. states, such as Oklahoma, Nevada, Arizona, and so on. Here he spent time working as a ranch hand, a cowboy, a prospector, and a writer for the Pony Express during the Apache War. These jobs, specifically that last one, earned Bill quite a bit of money, as transporting letters through active battlefields was dangerous and therefore lucrative work. Some writers earned upwards of $20 per letter delivered, which, when adjusted for inflation, works out to just about $750 each in today's money. This unexpected influx of cash allowed Bill to begin purchasing the types of food, clothing, alcohol, and other supplies, the likes of which he had never been able to afford. It gave him a taste of the good life, made him feel important and powerful, and those were feelings that Bill would spend the rest of his life chasing. As stated at the beginning of the episode, Bill began his criminal career robbing stagecoaches in California. Like delivering letters, this was also lucrative work, as stagecoaches in those days were often laden with everything from expensive and rare supplies to cold hard cash and gold. However, as we also mentioned earlier, Bill wasn't the type of person to throw his weight around during a robbery, and this is when we really get to see that in action. During his robberies, Bill made sure to maintain order not through threats of violence, but by speaking softly yet firmly in a manner that, even as a young man with little experience, reassured his victims that he was confident and in control of the situation. Although it's not been proven, he is often credited with coining the phrase "hands up," as when he would rob someone, he did everything he could to keep them calm and cooperative. He often reassured them that he would not hurt them so long as they did as he asked, and when they did, he followed through with his promise. Once stagecoach drivers had been relieved of their valuables, they were set free, usually without any injuries whatsoever. Sometimes Bill would even apologize for the inconvenience. As those drivers inevitably made their way to the nearest sheriff's office to report what had happened to them, word quickly spread of a highway bandit with a silver tongue. After just a few months of robbing, Bill had already earned his reputation as the gentleman bandit. This worked in his favor, as when travelers recognized him, they knew they would be safe if they cooperated. However, having a reputation also came with a sizable bounty. In 1866, Bill's short life of crime caught up with him when he was arrested for the first time in San Joaquin County, California on April 5th. Here he was charged with robbery and, following his conviction, spent 2 months in the San Joaquin County Jail before being discharged on June 9th of that same year. It's not clear which robbery was the one that got him caught, but what is clear is that Bill's legal troubles were far from over. Just 3 days after his release, he was rearrested and transported to Placer County, California, where he served at least 4 full years for a separate robbery. After this, he was then discharged again, arrested yet again, and transported to Calaveras County in 1871, where he was charged with several more crimes and told that he would spend at least another decade of his life performing hard manual labor. It was at this point that Bill's aspirations for the high life officially crumbled. He was well known and well respected, but he was also looking down a massive sentence. Now his only goal was to simply find freedom. In May of 1874, 8 full years since his initial arrest in 1866, Bill attempted to escape from the Calaveras County Penitentiary. This escape was unsuccessful, and he had another 4 years added to his already lengthy sentence. This meant that he would have been in prison until well into his 50s. However, thankfully for him, his sentence was commuted to only 12 years in 1877. He was officially discharged on July 14, 1880. When he was just about 40 years old. Now, having spent almost half his life up until this point in various prisons throughout California, Bill attempted to make something of himself. However, with few prospects at his disposal, he was never able to put his criminal lifestyle behind him. Shortly after his release, he met and began writing with a man named Bill Leroy, another Western outlaw known as the Colorado Bandit. Together, they began planning another stagecoach robbery, one that they hoped would earn them and their crew enough money to lay low for a while. Their chosen target was a stagecoach traveling east, and their plan went off without a hitch, netting them approximately $3,500, which would be slightly over $100,000 today. After this, the group tried to keep their heads down to avoid drawing suspicion. However, news of their actions quickly spread, an award was offered, and a posse was formed. This posse rode hard, catching up to Miner and Leroy in just a matter of days. During their confrontation, Leroy was captured and lynched, but Miner was able to escape by firing upon and wounding several of the men pursuing him. Fortunately for Miner, none of those men died, because just a few months later he would be rearrested again in Tuolumne County, California, after yet another robbery gone wrong. In total, Bill had only been free for less than 2 years, but in December of 1881, he was sentenced to 25 more years of hard labor. By 1901, Bill Miner, now 60 years old, was released from San Quentin prison. By this point in his life, his hair and mustache had turned gray, but even in his later years, prison had failed to extinguish his drive. Despite now having spent over 40 of his 60 years on Earth in prison, Bill was still eager to get back out there and make money the only way he knew how. The problem, however, was that the world Bill discovered upon being released was completely foreign to him. At the start of Bill's incarceration, Western legends like Billy the Kid and Wyatt Earp had been roaming and ruling the Western Plains, but by 1901, the American West was barely a decade away from being declared settled. The territories that would someday make up Utah, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona were all that remained wild, and Bill could see the writing on the wall. He didn't belong in the United States anymore because outlaws like him were being rounded up en masse to help usher the country into the new century. Since staying in the U.S. would almost guarantee he would be rearrested once he began committing crimes again, Bill made his way north through Oregon and Washington into British Columbia. Here he adopted the name George Edwards and presented himself as a rancher and prospector. He made money like this for a while, gaining a reputation as a solid and reliable businessman in the process. Nobody had a clue that their new friend George was actually the notorious outlaw Bill Miner. Around the year 1904, Bill partnered up with a group of former Confederate soldiers turned outlaw who were active in British Columbia at the time. Ranching may have been fine work for George Edwards, but Bill Miner was the same man he had always been. He told them he wanted to stage another robbery, but there was one small problem. In addition to the other changes that had occurred since the onset of Bill's incarceration, stagecoaches, his preferred targets, were now slowly becoming fewer and farther between. By this point, railroads dominated the transportation industry because they were capable of carrying much more cargo for much greater distances in a fraction of the time. They were just overall better, and they also became Bill's next preferred target. On September 10, 1904, Bill and his men stowed aboard Canadian Pacific's Transcontinental Express No. 1 shortly before it left the station. Then, at around 9:30 p.m. that night, with their guns ready, they approached the conductor, Nat Scott, and ordered him to halt the train at the Silverdale Crossing. This was approximately 22 miles east of Vancouver. Scott, who was caught entirely off guard, did as he was asked, stating that he was, quote, at their service. When the train was stopped, Bill told Scott to decouple the passenger cars from the engine and its mail car. Getting inside that mail car was Bill's primary goal, and they didn't need the hassle of dealing with dozens of unruly and nervous passengers as they raided it. Scott did as he was asked, and when this was done, Miner told him to move the engine and mail car 1 mile further down the track, leaving the passenger cars alone and stranded in the night. At this point, Scott assumed his life was over. The men all had their guns pointed at him, but Bill maintained his policy of not harming those who cooperated. Once they reached the spot where Miner felt they would be safe, they began ransacking the mail car. Inside its safe, they found 2 sacks of gold dust valued at $6,000, a stack of U.S. bonds worth $50,000, and a bundle of Australian securities worth somewhere near $200,000. It was the biggest haul of Bill's entire career. Following this, he and his men set off into the night on foot, and as they did, Bill called back to Scott, and he said something that would cement his place in Western history. He said, "Have a good night." Scott, who couldn't believe what he had just heard, returned the sentiment. "Good night," he said. "I hope you have a pleasant journey." Bill Miner simply laughed at this and replied, "We hope so too." A short time later, the group sailed across the Fraser River to a spot where their horses were tied up and waiting for them. They then rode upstream to the town of Chilliwack to safety. As the sun rose the following day, the Pinkerton Detective Agency was hired to investigate the robbery, but Bill, who was still going by George Edwards, was never captured. He simply sat inside the local cafe in Chilliwack, eating breakfast and watching as the Pinkerton agents walked up and down the streets. They were searching for him, but never once suspected that he was right there under their noses. Throughout the next 2 years of his life, between 1904 and 1906, Bill continued to pose as a rancher and prospector named George Edwards by day while slipping away to rob trains by night. These 2 years yielded his best run since first starting his criminal career in the 1860s, and he managed to steal a large but unspecified amount during various robberies during that time. However, his good luck was about to run out yet again. On May 18, 1906, Bill and 2 other men, Tom Dunn and Lewis Calhoun, set out to rob a train carrying a shipment of cash and gold that had been collected for a relief fund that benefited victims of the San Francisco earthquake that had occurred a month prior. They expected to get away clean with a large payout as they had done many times before. However, during the robbery, they accidentally chose the wrong car and only managed to net a measly $15. Making matters even worse, one of the train's passengers released their getaway horses, which forced him to flee into the woods on foot to hide from the fast-approaching authorities. As officers combed the woods searching for them, they stumbled upon the group, and Bill tried to pass himself off as his alter ego, George Edwards. He claimed that he, Tom, and Lewis were all out prospecting, but the posse didn't believe their story. They drew down on the men, and Tom and Lewis returned fire but were eventually captured. Bill, on the other hand, did not even draw his weapon. He simply surrendered. After being convicted for this robbery in the nearby town of Kamloops, Bill was loaded onto a train to be transported northeast to a prison in New Westminster, where he was likely set to spend the rest of his life. As the train transporting Bill approached the town, the guards charged with escorting him noticed a large crowd of people lined up along either side of the tracks. Fearing that Miner was about to be attacked by a mob of vigilantes seeking their own justice, they loaded and prepared their weapons. But as the train neared the crowd, they realized that the people weren't yelling, they were cheering. They weren't angry with Bill, they were celebrating him for robbing the Canadian Pacific Railway, which in those days was famously unpopular for a number of understandable reasons. This event itself cemented Bill in history as one of the last famous outlaws, and although people assumed he would die in the BC penitentiary, he did not. In 1907, Bill escaped and fled back to the United States, back to the South, where he was likely born, and then into Georgia. Here he continued his crime spree unabated for another 2 years before being recaptured again, imprisoned in Georgia, escaping and being recaptured twice, and then eventually succumbing to gastritis that he developed from drinking dirty water during one of those escape attempts. The legacy that Bill Miner left behind is a complicated one. On one hand, he was a criminal who robbed and stole and likely murdered some people along the way, but the fact that he often chose to rob insured stagecoaches and trains has kept him in the good graces of most. Today, the Keg Steakhouse and Bar, a restaurant chain in British Columbia, continues to offer the Bill Miner pie for dessert, and their dining room is decorated with pictures of him as well as memorabilia from the Old West. Pubs and brewing companies in the area also offer drinks named after him, and there's a dedicated mural to one of the trains he robbed on the exterior of Cactus Jack's Saloon and Dance Hall in Kamloops, BC, the town where Bill was welcomed by the cheering crowd after his capture and conviction in 1906. In 1982, a feature-length Canadian film titled The Grey Fox was also released, and that focused on Bill's life. Today, Bill Miner's body is buried in the Memorial Hill Cemetery in Milledgeville, Georgia. The inscription on his tombstone reads, "Bill Miner, the last of the famous Western bandits, born 1843, died in the Milledgeville State Prison, September 2nd, 1914. This video was researched, written, and narrated by me, Matthew Markham, and I'd like to thank you all so much for clicking on it and watching until the end. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and a comment below and subscribe for more interesting videos like this one in the future. You can also follow me on Twitter or visit my website to see some of my other work. Links for both are in my channel's description. Once again, thank you so much for watching.